Very good.
Welcome to CNN Talk. We're talking about the Iranian situation again because it's escalated. Would you say?
Isn't it more of a de-escalation when something looks like it's going to happen and it doesn't happen?
Not if it's still going to happen and they only called it off for strategic reasons.
That's true too. Yeah. I mean, look, nobody feels very comfortable about this, right? I mean, it does look like a situation of extreme jeopardy.
This is the latest we have, Bonnie. A US official with direct knowledge says a military operation to strike Iran was set to begin last night when the White House called it off.
Well, we have to keep in mind that getting all of those assets together and then having them stand down is a serious thing in and of itself, That this command came from the White House is very typical Donald Trump. So in a sense, here we are discussing the Donald Trump world of chaos, which is exactly what he wants. That's how he runs his operation. The problem is that because he's the master of the media, we can't get other voices in there, particularly bringing out U.S. assets at this level and standing them down at this moment. That in itself is an extremely dangerous thing to do because it could have been an accident.
And the military targets were a limited set of Iranian radars and missile batteries. I guess it's not necessarily the targets that matter as much as the fact that they were planning a premeditated strike.
Absolutely. I agree with my colleagues. It's a very unsettling situation. I mean, Iran is obviously the main power broker or one of the main power brokers in that part of the world. There is an escalation in the sense that last week we were discussing on CNN Talk shipping going through the Straits of Hormuz, the Gulf of Oman, the kind of windpipe of the global economy where a fifth of the world's seaborne oil is transported. There were tankers there that were attacked. The Americans say by the Iranians say not by us, Governor. I think what's been incredible is how other Western powers have not immediately believed America's version of events.
And they have
like
every
the
reason
Germans,
not to.
the French, the Brits have been slightly on the fence.
Yeah.
People have been talking about the Gulf of Tonkin incident in the mid-60s, which brought US into the Vietnam War, which turned out to be a false alarm. So the danger now is that we end up with a conflict by accident. And the idea that Trump said something and then changed his mind, that sounds to me not like a kind of a change of mind, but a premeditated warning shot.
Oh, do you think he actually planned?
Yeah, I do.
Wow.
Planned to stand down.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I agree with that. I mean, this is Trump's modus operandi. He wants us to believe that he is chaos. He wants us to believe that his administration is a chaotic situation, but it isn't. This is calculated to keep us on our toes and on edge.
Welcome to CNN Talk. Iran then finishing the week in this escalation with the United States by downing a US drone. How should the US respond?
Iran made a big mistake. This drone was in international waters.
Mr. President, how will you respond?
You'll find out.
The Iranians are saying the shooting down of the drone was a clear message to the United States that Iran's airspace is a red line.
The New York Times reports that US President Donald Trump approved
military strikes against Iran
as retaliation after Iran shot down an American drone.
But then abruptly pulled back. Planes were in the air, ships in position, when suddenly the order came to stand down.
Iran claims the American drone was in Iranian airspace and had its own dire warning.
We have no intention to fight with any countries, but we are completely ready for war.
It's unclear why President Trump changed his mind on the operation.
The real risk is here of enormous escalation that just keeps on going.
Have a look at our Facebook feed if you want to get involved in the discussion. Ahmad says they shouldn't respond. Downing their drone was the response. Jay says, listen, man, our taxes pay for that drone. We should make them pay.
Yeah, we should make them pay, Jason. He does have a point, though. These are multi-million-dollar assets.
Yeah, so more than $100 million
this
worth.
isn't. These aren't
small.
Yeah, these aren't toys. And for the President of the United States who went to military academy and avoided the draft 5 times, this may actually look like a toy to him, but it isn't. And that gentleman's point is very well taken. But the other thing I want to say, too, is Donald Trump creates an air of chaos because that's how he runs his ship. This is calculated. The other thing, and we know this because at the beginning, he brings in a guy like John Bolton, who is the world's Iranian hawk. There's no way nothing like this was going to happen with John Bolton and the administration.
A U.S. official with direct knowledge of the situation told CNN that a military operation to strike Iran was set to begin on Thursday night when the White House called it off. You're of the view that it was always a plan. It could potentially have always been the plan to call it off.
Yeah, I think so. I think it was a calculated warning shot. The diplomatic wheels are in turn, and only by the president's mercy and judgment has he reprieved. Look, Trump has obviously been at loggerheads with Iran since before he took office. He campaigned on reversing the Obama-era nuclear non-proliferation deal, which, of course, was signed by the rest of the UN Security Council and Germany, was seen at the time as a major breakthrough. Iran, as far as we know, has largely complied with that agreement, according to the international weapons inspectors, and yet Trump pulled America out of that agreement, partly because it was Obama, partly because hawks around him felt that Iran was surreptitiously not sticking to the deal. That seriously undermined the moderates in Iran, people like President Rouhani, the Scottish-educated, English-speaking president of Iran, who's been up against the more conservative, more insular Ayatollahs. And so more insular forces, the Revolutionary Guard and so on in Iran, are now on the offensive with Rouhani being marginalised.
And just so, in terms of what we know, there's a dispute, isn't there? So Iran claim it was shot down in its airspace.
Yeah.
The US say it was outside their airspace, in international airspace. And this is pretty crucial to the claims being made here.
It does seem like this should be quite easily resolved, right? There will be a way to impartially adjudicate whether it was in Iran's airspace or not. The US has released coordinates to support their claim.
So we need to see the Iranian
We need to see the Iranian coordinates. But, you know...
Only Google Maps knows.
It was shot down. So wherever it landed was where it was shot down. This is not something that we can...
Quite tidal, though, that.
But I think we have to go back to what Liam is talking about. Basically, the core of it is the Trump mythos. Donald Trump, first of all, aim is to destroy the Obama legacy. Whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. And this was a big, big piece of it. The second part of his mythos is that he sees Israel as under existential threat by Iran, just as Iraq was perceived as an existential threat from Israel. So we've got Trump placing the United States of America squarely into that sort of also the proxy war without actually being in the proxy war. So he brings a hawk into his administration like John Bolton. He has an entire cabinet that is acting. They all should get Oscars for their roles. They're not actually condoned by the Senate. So the Pentagon is a mess. Literally a mess, because there's no one in charge of it, hardly. So now we're in a situation where this man is sitting there at midnight saying, oh, well, you know, call him off.
And the dangerous thing when you're dealing with Iranians is that, you know, you've got these mixed messages coming out of Washington. They don't actually probably understand fully what the message is, how they interpret the message that's important.
That's why I feel a little bit sceptical about the idea that it's all premeditated, because mostly it looks extremely unprofessional
and chaotic.
Yeah, I mean, I know that that's his. I know that he kind of casts people into insecurity deliberately as a kind of impunity. You know, I don't behave like normal administrations. I don't behave like normal presidents. I do it my way. I know that that's his shtick, but I still think it's very hard to decipher as an act of foreign policy. So I'm still sceptical about it being...
As an act of domestic politics, though, let's just examine it. So, I mean, just for the purposes of conversation, you know, Trump, unusually for a first-term president, could get through a whole presidential term without actually waging a war. That's where we are. Of course, his rhetoric is very bellicose, and of course, he's surrounded himself with the likes of John Bolton, as we said, National Security Advisor, with a pretty belligerent Secretary of State in Mike Pompeo. On the other hand, you know, the regular Republican Party, the GOP, don't trust this guy. He's a homeboy from New York. He's not a proper Midwest or Southern Republican, so they don't trust him. So he surrounded himself with quite hawkish people. Then on the other hand, he's always come back from the brink when push comes to shove.
Because that's how he runs his businesses.
No, I understand. But in terms of, you know, when history is written, the history of this period may be how America didn't go to war with Iran, despite lots of provocation from both sides, and there is provocation from both sides, and a lot of rhetoric, rather than this being the time when
history will record that the United States of America had a president who totally destabilized the region. Okay, it's not a shooting war.
Yeah.
It's not a shooting war. You're right. My whole lifetime, the United States has been involved in a war, one way or the other. Exactly. But this president's idea is to destabilize the region with a minimum of loss because, again, his constituency is the military. If he goes into war and he loses boys, in quotes, he's toast. No, he
his
knows
constituency is the military on the one hand,
absolutely,
in Washington, but his base in the heartlands is blue-collar America.
They are
want
military.
Their boys and girls coming back
exactly,
in body
that's what I'm trying to say. So he's toast if that happens.
Hamisi on Facebook says war is not the answer. The US must negotiate, and Mengistu says it would be stupid of the US to go to war with Iran over a drone. We're going to go to Fred. He's in Tehran. Fred, you know, a week of a lot of talk, a lot of movement in that region. Bring it together for us and how worried we should be.
Oh, look, I think it's an extremely dangerous situation, Max, that's going on right here in the Persian Gulf area. I think that there's a big chance right now of some sort of miscalculation happening between these two sides that could escalate the situation. The interesting thing has been that both sides, both the U.S. and Iran, have been saying they don't want this to escalate any further. They don't want this to descend into a shooting war. But at the same time, it doesn't seem as though either of these two sides has found any sort of off-ramp. And if we're hearing now that apparently there was already an operation that had been started, apparently, for strikes on Iran that was called off at the last minute, and you can see just how strong a situation and how dangerous a situation we are in right now. The Iranians just came out a couple of minutes ago and showed some of the debris of that drone that they say that they've shot down. They're claiming that it was in their airspace. The Americans obviously saying that it was an international airspace. All that continues to ratchet up the tensions. And I think one of the things that the Iranians are saying here right now, they say they're watching very closely what America is doing in this region. They say that if the Americans make a military move, like, for instance, shooting at their air defense systems, that this would not lead to any sort of limited strike. There's no such thing, they say, as a limited strike on Iran. They say that they would respond in a very forceful way. And one of the things that the Iranians keep telling us again and again and again, I've heard this from Revolutionary Guard commanders, former Revolutionary Guard commanders, they say their response would not only be with their regular military, but with their proxy forces that they have throughout the region. And it's one of the things that one former commander told me. He said, look, the U.S. needs to understand, if it goes into a shooting war with Iran, that Iran has a militia next to almost every American military base in the Middle Eastern region, and those militias would be mobilized. So that's something that the Iranians say should be food for thought for the folks in Washington. Again, the government here says they don't want war. The government in Washington says they don't want war. And just to give you guys a little bit of a flavor from the street, because obviously we've been talking to a lot of people here in Tehran as well. They're extremely concerned about the situation that this could descend out of control. But of course, they are also in a dire economic situation, and one that was massively exacerbated by the fact that the U.S. left that nuclear agreement, and these massive sanctions have been in place, which the Iranians, of course, call economic warfare, guys.
Thank you, Fred. It is one of the things that the White House is having to consider, the fact that an attack on Iran isn't an attack on just that geographical area. It has tentacles going out into all sorts of other groups, the militias that Fred was referring to.
Well, absolutely. And I do wonder, I mean, as you say, if you are dealing with something which could imminently bring the loss of American life, even Trump, I imagine, would think about how that would play both in, you know, he's not known for his kind of foresight, and he's not known as a very moral man, but he knows as well as anybody how badly that would go down.
And how complex the reaction could be.
how complex the reaction could be as we start gearing up for White House 2020. Just this last week, of course, he confirmed that he would be running for a second term. The reaction isn't just diplomatic and military. I mean, Iran is a very serious power broker in the region. This is a country of 80 million people. This is the third biggest member of OPEC. This could be a top 20 economy in the world. And we've already seen, since Thursday, oil spike 5 or 6%. I don't want to sound too sort of financial and pecuniary when people are worried literally for their lives and their livelihoods. But that will play on Trump's mind too. He doesn't want increased gas prices on the forecourts that American families are having to pay as politics starts getting really serious domestically as he runs for the White House. And what he also doesn't want, is to mobilize against him in the region the Chinese and the Russians. I mean, when push comes to shove, will the Russians and the Chinese back Iran?
But I think what you're saying about the domestic politics is what we always have to keep in mind. There's always a double mirror with Trump. Trump is down in the polls. He is beaten in matchups. These very, very early days, very early days. He's beaten in matchups by everybody, even Buttigieg, even Elizabeth Warren, Sanders, everybody. Trump is a television guy. He is probably the master of television. He watches ratings. He sees how that's playing. All the headlines are being grabbed by this, so he'll change the headlines. The problem for him, though, and you're right, both of you, about what you're saying, Trump has to watch the Midwest. He has to watch Florida. He's got the South. That's no problem. Yeah. He's got to watch the Midwest and watch the Florida.
Those swing states.
Exactly. Yeah. He's been sending in farmers' welfare to the tune of $16 billion every other month. If this messes up, and it could, he's got to pour more money into these places, and he's got to look at that.
Let's get the view of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, because this was what one major general said after their attack on the drone.
We have no intention to fight with any countries, but we are completely ready for war. What happened today was an obvious sign of this accurate message.
They're not denying they shot down this drone, and they said it's a very clear message. Did the Americans really realize who they're dealing with?
Can I put this on the table really quickly? Because we are talking about a mano situation now. We're talking about virility. We're talking about men standing up. This guy right here, he's not the boss that Ayatollah. It's the Revolutionary Guards. If they get tired of this, if they get sick of being pushed around, they're going to jump. And this is what Trump wants. This is guys, and this is a face-off.
And
this is the dangerous thing.
Leadership structure, isn't it?
Domestic politics on both sides could cause the accident that none of us on this panel want to see. Not just Trump versus his own sort of military defense establishment, hawks in the Pentagon and, of course, in the White House, but also in Iran. I started on this conversation talking about Rouhani. Rouhani's won elections. He was a popular president on a whole vision of Iran opening up to the world, doing this deal with America, there being no sanctions, and Iran finally, having a good standard of living, which the education of its people, its resources, its sophistication, its massive foreign investment over the years dictates. The Revolutionary Guards don't want any of that. They want to be insular. They want to keep their own power. They want to keep Iran as a sort of more medieval society. Right. They're against Rouhani. And these guys, don't want to lose face as well, as Bonnie says.
Maybe that's what dawned on Trump when he called this decision to stand down.
What, that they're medievalists? I mean, you don't want to mess with the
Can we control the Revolutionary Guard, but not necessarily dealing with the politicians in the country?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I do think it would give any sane person pause for reflection that just that you're dealing with kind of a political tendency which is so kind of death culty. That I would certainly hesitate before engaging with that.
He did step back.
Yeah,
he did step back.
Today.
I also did. Today. I dispute the oil tanker stuff from last week, because I don't think that there is sound enough evidence that it was the Revolutionary Guard.
These are the incidents that caused all this latest tension. We're talking about the drone shot down the oil tankers. That was on June the 13th with these mines that were attached, right? And then
I think there was a real moment in history. I completely agree with Zoe Williams on this. There was a moment in history because ordinarily, for most of my life, if America says something happened in the Middle East, The other Western powers say, oh, yes, of course, that happened. America says this happened, it happened. But I've been hearing, publicly and privately, senior people in governments across the Western world talking about the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, when America ended up going into the Vietnam War on false premises, saying that North Vietnamese forces had attacked a US military vessel, and it didn't happen in the same way. And historians have since corroborated that view. And for America to say the Iranians attacked this US tanker and this Japanese-owned tanker, and for the likes of the Germans, the French, and to some extent the British, undermine that view,
we're
not
talking about
deliberately
a different world
corroborate it,
now.
is unbelievable.
But this is a different time.
It's unbelievable.
This is a different time. 1964, there was no Germany to speak of. There was
America
a West
was at the
and
apogee of its power.
Total different world.
No
right?
longer.
Yeah,
no
not
longer.
at all.
People on Facebook making the point that, questioning why this drone needs to be so close to Iran. The US and Iran are almost at war, says Winnie. What is a US drone doing near Iranian airspace? The US is so far away. What do you think? Let us know on our Facebook feed.
The Gulf of Tonkin was a very, very different situation. The United States of America had been involved with Vietnam under John Kennedy since 1960.
Absolutely.
So there was an opportunity, spurred by the Hawks in both sides to go into Vietnam. They wanted to go into Vietnam. We had propped up the Vietnamese government.
Yeah.
They were our clients.
But LBJ went on television and told the American people something had happened, but it didn't actually happen.
Because this was an age where people believed in the communist threat. I mean, we all grew up on that.
Right.
That's what it is. Now this doesn't happen anymore. This doesn't exist. But Trump is a Cold War baby. So this is easy to stoke up this kind of rhetoric.
He is
and
a
this
Cold
kind
War
of thing.
baby, but he's also as a kind of New York television jock. He also doesn't want to press the war button because he knows it would play very badly with his own blue-collar electorate.
He doesn't have to if the war is happening in your head.
Yeah.
It doesn't really have
or
to
if it's
happen.
a push-button war.
Exactly.
If it's
It
a
doesn't
push-button
have
war.
to happen.
Also,
and it's not going to happen.
I mean, I really hate kind of dissecting the personality of Trump because I think it's beneath all of our dignity. But I do think he's quite a lazy man, and he's quite money fixated.
Not lazy.
He is quite
No,
lazy.
he's not lazy.
Look at all the golfing.
He's not
Look
lazy.
at all the
That's not from laziness. That's
golf,
not recreation.
Golf is incredibly lazy.
No, it's not. Do you play it?
How should the US respond to the downing of its drone by Iran? The question we're asking you today. World War III, Ignatius says, 95% loading. Ali says, if you fly a drone over a hostile country, you need to have worked out all the possible scenarios beforehand. We've just got some pictures in from Iranian TV showing the wreckage of the drone. They don't deny shooting it down. They do deny that it was in international airspace. They say it was in their airspace, which many Iranians would relate to and say, well, fine to shoot it down.
Yeah,
and no one died.
We're not here to promote the Iranian perspective, but for the purposes of conversation and balance, the Iranians will say this was a threat. They'll say it's deliberate provocation, and the US drone was asking for it. Of course, it's an unmanned aircraft, but it's still worth tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. But look, if a major piece of US hardware is shot out of the sky by a hostile force, I mean, the US has to respond, right? This is the world's...
Yeah, by saying, sorry, we wandered into your airspace.
Hegemony.
No,
there has to be some response.
You respond by saying, sorry, we wandered into your airspace.
No, it's not this one.
A drone is unmanned.
This one from CENTCOM, just, they're saying that it's definitely, in international airspace, they're giving the coordinates there.
Where's that
but that's in contrast to what the Iranians are saying.
But hang on a second, I don't understand these two red lines, right? Are those territorial waters?
The bottom one's the international, the domestic waters of UAE and Oman. The top one is the domestic waters of Iran.
Okay,
so only between them is international.
The top red line is the Iranian line.
Also, Trump has got, we are in an election cycle, even though it's very early. Trump has got a lot of attack dogs in the Senate, principally the leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, is up for re-election this year. So he's laying down like a dead dog to allow Trump to control this narrative and keep the country like this.
Most
are
are saying war's not the answer. Diplomacy is the best answer. Why aren't they trying more diplomacy?
It's incredibly difficult to see where the diplomatic solution, because if you look at the premise is that they're already on a very hostile footing because of the sinking of those 2 tankers. America is already...
They weren't sunk, they were just attacked with missiles.
Sorry, they weren't sunk, you're right. America has said that was kind of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. It's very difficult to see from there how you go into a normal diplomatic...
Which you don't. I fully agree.
Are there any back routes?
Back channels?
But you can't do it. You can't do a handbrake turn. This will take time. I mean, you know, if you were being extremely optimistic, you would say that there's a conflict being created now that Trump can eventually massage towards some kind of resolution before the election. That's in the best case scenario. On the other hand, he has to manage his domestic audience, and his domestic audience isn't just his blue-collar base who doesn't want war and the liberal intelligentsia in the swing states who don't want war. He's also having to deal with the GOP who don't trust him, the military-industrial establishment that don't trust him, and they will be constantly accusing him of being too soft on foreign policy.
But you have a guy in John Bolton who's saying bomb, bomb, bomb Iran on national television to the tune of the Beach Boys, and this is exactly how the foreign policy is.
And for now, Trump isn't doing what he says, for now.
Well, he doesn't need to because he's got us talking about it.
Sorry. He's being very polite today, Zoe.
Sorry, Zoe.
I've just got some manners in the interim. No, I mean, I think the framing of... I think since Iraq, the kind of presentation of war has been quite different in American political discourse. I think it used to be like a perfectly natural stance that the hawks would go, let's go and have a war. And now, even people who would naturally have that tendency are much, much more reluctant to go anywhere near.
On Facebook says America must attack Iran. If they don't, it will show them to be weak.
Well, you see, that is an aspect of it as well.
The word cloud, Bonnie.
Oh, right. Let's see.
Bringing out the main words
Trump,
from the comments.
Iran, drone war,
war is the big one.
Yeah.
We're asking how the world, US should respond, and war comes
Trump's
out
war.
As the...
Provoked, dangerous.
So either people don't want a war, they do want a war, but war is the debate.
Well, not is very large, right?
We're not at war, but this is clearly... well, I would say this is the most serious situation between Iran and the United States since the hostage crisis, the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis, which, you know, in the late 70s. I think I have to say this, by moving the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, Trump did something that went down well to a domestic audience in the US, but was seen as deeply provocative in the Middle East. By ending America's involvement in the Obama-era nuclear non-proliferation deal, he also was seen to be chiding moderates in Iran who had gone for that deal, saying it would deliver economic openness and growth, and he strengthened the Revolutionary Guard.
And Rotner says the US withdrew from the nuclear agreement. That's what started all of this.
Well, Trump needs an enemy. He's a guy who does not exist unless there's an enemy. And the enemy has to be simple. The enemy has to be clear, and the enemy has to be not like us. So what better than a bunch of Iranians and women running around with headscarves? This is important, because then what Trump can do is play his narrative through these images, and that's what he does. He doesn't talk to anybody.
What about these two contrasting comments? Sorry. Akim says Trump is destabilizing the whole region, but Marcia says the region was destabilized many years ago.
Well, I mean, I don't know if they are contrasting. I mean, a really unstable region can always be further destabilized. You know, everything tends naturally towards entropy, and it takes kind of embedded knowledge to keep it away from entropy.
Has he created the tensions there, or did they come are they homegrown?
I mean, I don't know if I'd frame it like that. Obviously, there are homegrown tensions, and obviously there are tensions in the region generally, and obviously those tensions do kind of centre on Iran because it is the kind of richest, most functioning and most closed society there. So there is a huge amount going on which people don't know in the rest of the world. There's very little porousness in you know,
I'm not sure about that. You know, there is massive Western investment in Iran.
Absolutely.
I mean, French car makers make a fifth of their cars in Iran,
is
right?
Very important.
This is an incredibly sophisticated society that, you know, before the Iranian Revolution was one of the most advanced economies on the earth.
And the idea that Zoe
and there was a moment just after the Obama deal, there was a moment, and I travelled to Iran during this period on several occasions, where, you know, Iran, you know, city analysts on Wall Street and London were writing brokers' notes. This is the most exciting emerging market
But I think
in the world.
what Zoe said, that's the most important thing, anyway, to me, is that Trump lives in an entropic universe. This is what he wants. This is the way the world is supposed to be. And then he stands up and he commands it to go this way, and he commands it to go that way. The picture of Iran as some kind of place, some primitive place, is ridiculous.
Yeah,
he knows it's ridiculous. Wall Street knows it's ridiculous. The Pentagon knows it's ridiculous. But Trump talks to those farmers in Iowa who he persuades that somehow if he doesn't do something, they're going to all drone into their cornfields and wipe them out.
But look, there is space between these two positions. A, that it's an incredibly sophisticated society, and B, that it's a very primitive society. It's possible for this society to be sophisticated, but also be quite closed off.
Yeah.
And it is quite closed off. And there is a kind of, and it does mean that it's a kind of tabula rasa to project political kind of
projection. It's closed off, obviously, intellectually and culturally. In some ways, it's closed off if the mullahs and the ayatollahs have their way. On the other hand, you had a big leap of faith under Rouhani to open up to the global economy.
You're a big fan of this, Rouhani.
No. I just understand Iranian politics.
We're going to let them keep talking. I'm going to talk to you. War is not the answer, says Sepeda. And MJ says USA should respond, otherwise Iran will get out of hand. Listen to the debate again by going to Apple Podcasts, looking up CNN Talk. Thank you for watching and listening.